Hello fellow wand lovers. The second part of the the Force expansion is just around the corner. Today I thought I'd make a small video talking about what I expect from it. Though keep in mind I'm not a Force main, I'm basically just a tourist that plays the class from time to time. Also keep in mind I won't be talking about what I expect from the upcoming Tech Arts customizations, which release at the same time as the Force expansion. With that out of the way, let's talk about Rod. Rod has a couple issues that immediately come to mind. For starters, let's talk about elemental bullets and the weapon action. The Rod weapon action is currently in an awkward spot because it's not DPS positive. This pretty much strong-arms Force players to parry with either Jifoy or Type 2 grants. Both actions generate the same elemental bullet as with weapon action, but here, parrying results in a DPS positive attack. Because of that, we can't simply buff the elemental bullet for the sake of weapon action DPS, because it will make parrying with Jifoy and Type 2 grants even more overpowered. To solve this issue, I suggest taking a similar approach that Wan's Photonic Furies took. The devs should implement a level 2 elemental bullet with higher potency and make it exclusive to the weapon action. This way both parry methods can remain viable. Instead of shutting out one in favor of the other, we get options. I also think the cancel timings on techniques could be loosened up a bit. Right now it can be a bit tough to deal with the animation locks compared to other weapons, where it feels like you can cancel into weapon action at any moment. Maintain PP gain could also regenerate more PP than it currently does. I don't think Force has PP problems, but the amount it restores right now isn't great. Many people dub this the worst PP recovery skill, and I can see why. Technique domination is the biggest elephant in the room though. As of right now, it's a 30% buff during downs that exclusively buffs technique damage and nothing else. Compound techniques, normal attacks, or other skills like Talis weapon action, photon arts, or tricky capacitor are completely ignored. This screws with Force's damage rotations, essentially turning them upside down. Rod impact, compound techniques, and tricky capacitor suddenly become weaker than just continuing to using regular techniques. I think this skill should affect every Rod and Talis action equally. That is how the chase skill works on fighter, and if 30% damage to the entire Force kit is too strong, then the devs should retune all of the values across the board. Next on the list are compound techniques. Their power has been lacking, and I think they should be either buffed by 20%, or alternatively have the elemental weakness bonus applied. This way only 1 out of 3 compounds receives the 20% bonus in any given encounter. Additionally, I think compound techniques could have their cooldown reduced. For example, Pinion Blade is much stronger and only has a 30-second cooldown. Having a 60-second cooldown on compound techniques just feels like a carryover from PSO2. In PSO2, compound techniques were broken enough to warrant the 60-second timer. Force suffers from a bit of an identity crisis right now. It is treated and balanced like if it was a support class, however it doesn't really have any real support outside of elemental downs. In my opinion, Force should be a powerhouse, a selfish DPS class first and foremost. After all, we already have a support-based technique class, it's called Tector. You might have heard about it on my channel before. Force should be the best class when it comes to dealing damage through techniques, and I don't mean just in terms of quality of life, but also in terms of raw power. This is why I hope Force will receive a new skill that further pushes it into a selfish DPS. Speaking of techniques, I think some of the elemental blots need a few of their values adjusted. A lot of them expire way too quickly, which is unfortunate when the enemy decides to do something cinematic that prevents Force players from keeping the blots up. This issue also hurts Tector a little, because our damage loop is a little bit too long to maintain certain elemental gimmicks, like Barda Blot. Additionally, some elemental gimmicks are a little bit too weak, and because of how elemental bullet gameplay works on Force, it's easy to waste resources, especially with Zon Gale. Other than that, I think techniques will likely see a lot of the same improvements that wand actions saw back in October. Their overall damage will likely receive a 10% bump, and they'll also receive a ton of quality of life improvements. I think it's also possible that they will make techniques compatible with weapon color variants. Megid already has color variant compatibility in one of its customizations, so the precedent is there. Could you imagine blue foy techniques? That would be so cool. When it comes to Talis, I don't even know where to begin. Out of all weapons, I think Talis is the most underdeveloped one. Let's start with the gameplay loop. Right now, the gameplay loop revolves around upkeep of DPS negative actions, in order to maximize damage on your DPS positive actions. In general, it feels like the weapon is way too punishing to play for no real reason, other than neglect from the developers. You have to use PA to deploy a Talis formation, but because the act of deploying is weak, you're being punished for not using the Type 1 customization, which extends formation deployment, allowing you to avoid using the PA. PP are a non-issue on Talis, so the only reason one would still use the weapon action is to maintain Talis sign marking. A 5% damage buff that can't be applied by the AoE version of the weapon action, and therefore is pretty much exclusive to single target gameplay. Tricky Capacitor is a very slow build-up skill that does a pitiful amount of damage. And to top it all off, it just feels like compound techniques don't really gel with Talis gameplay as well as they do with wand or rod gameplay. If the Talis deployment isn't about to end on its own, you have to manually revoke said deployment to be able to make use of elemental blots caused by compound techniques. This whole process just feels very clunky. To tackle these issues, Talis will need a couple of improvements. I don't think we can do anything to fix the deployment upkeep forcing us to use DPS negative actions, so instead we could approach the issue from a different angle. Certain actions like Tricky Capacitor could simply extend the duration of Talis deployment. This could combo nicely with the Type 1 customization for dedicated Talis players, allowing them to stay in that buffed period of the customization for longer. Additionally, Convergence Shot needs an accuracy fix outside of Type 2 customization. I don't know why, but sometimes, it feels like the shots miss on purpose, even though they would have easily hit the target if they swayed better. This might be easy to fix. Type 1 Medjed is proof that the devs are capable of doing it. I don't have many wishes for Spread Shot other than increasing its range, and changing the method in which you decide which of the two AoE formations you pick. Spread Shot cycles through two formations by letting it play out fully or cancelling it midway through. This is different from how you decide between the single target and AoE version of weapon action. This is a minor pet peeve of mine, but this inconsistency makes these interactions jarring. I would prefer if they both worked the same, you press the stick to get the frontal AoE spread shot, or don't push the stick to get the circular one. The weapon action needs higher damage. Right now it is in a very bad spot, and it gets worse with each bullet that misses its target. Because it is a 20 seconds long damage over time, I think the damage could be easily doubled without being too overpowered. Yes, that would make it technically a 600 DPS attack, but it would also give a little bit of wiggle room, allowing a few shots to miss their target before becoming DPS negative. Since using the weapon action and then swapping to multi-weapon halves the potency of the dot, I don't think it would even be that overpowered in the current meta. Alternatively, if they're not gonna buff its damage significantly, then the weapon action needs to provide something else. It should build Talis sign marking and Tricky Capacitor at a faster rate. This would kill two birds with one stone since both skills build up way too slowly for how little damage they provide. While staying on topic of Talis sign marking, it's a bit silly that it's impossible to use it in AoE. The weapon action straight up doesn't build up the mark in its AoE form. I guess this is deliberate to make the mark purely a single target tool, and if that's the case, then the weapon action really needs to inflict it faster. Tricky Capacitor needs higher single target damage. Thanks to Tricky Capacitor Bloom Flourish, the game can now distinguish between single target and AoE Tricky Capacitor, but they still deal the same amount of damage regardless of which version you use. Which seems rather weird in terms of balancing. Tricky Capacitor is a very quick and a rather weak attack, so its impact on average DPS is very small. It definitely needs a chunky buff to feel impactful in single target encounters. In AoE situations, the current Tricky Capacitor is fine. Alternatively, Talis sign marking, which is already a tool exclusive for single target damage, could also apply to Tricky Capacitor. 5% ain't much, but I'll take anything at this point. Will all of these changes happen? Probably not. I myself am optimistic after seeing how good of an expansion Tector got. Regardless of what happens, I'm sure Force players will be eating good. With that being said, I can't wait for the upcoming headline. We're gonna see a preview of content coming early next year. I assume it's going to show the new Dark Falls. Until then, take care!